I hope you know what I mean right away when I say this. Your PhD, the dissertation, the primary dissertation project, failed in the absolute best way possible.
100%. I think better than ever, we know what the data can't tell us. And so I think we have a really solid grasp on knowing when to leverage which legs of the stool of evidence-based practice. And I think the strike zone for effective training programs in the vast majority of scenarios is way wider than people think.
So the first of our three big remaining questions in training science is, does fatigue harm your ability to elicit a hypertrophy stimulus? So just generally speaking, there is little evidence of overtraining within typical study durations. Welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Despite some speculation out there, we're still here. We're still in the studio. And we're still podcasting. This is season 2, episode 12. And I know absolutely no one cares about that because we've had some podcasts released in the wrong order and no one commented, no one said anything. So
I've noticed a lot of podcasts have just kind of ditched the episode number thing. I think that's something they're holding on to, which I mean makes sense, you know?
I think we should just ditch it after this one. But for now, season 2, episode 12. Thank you for tuning in. Zach, I'll let you kick this off. It's been... Let's see, we're in early October now. It's been at least a couple months since we've recorded a podcast. We said we were back at the start of season 2. I think it's safe to say we're back. You know, we got the studio, got the YouTube channel, and honestly, listens increased a ton. Downloads increased a ton. Now, are we balling out like some of the big name podcasters? Absolutely not, but I would say that's a feature. That's a feature, not a bug. So everything is intentional here. We were actually just maybe growing a little bit too fast, getting too much engagement. So we decided to slow down. So that's going to be the perspective I choose to take. But I'm curious if you have any insights on what you've been up to on the last couple of months, where things are headed with the show, and what people can expect.
Oh, man. I mean, in terms of what I've been up to, I'm going to really try to save.
Keep in mind, it's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while. I don't even know. What was the last episode? We had a kind of a coaching-oriented episode. I'm trying to remember what kind of updates we last gave.
When did your dissertation training study get preprinted? Was that before or after our most recent podcast? That's what I was kind of teeing up for you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's kind of what I was going to. So that got preprinted on July 31st. So I'm not sure when our last episode was, but
probably right around there, I think.
Right around then. Yeah, so that's been out. It's been good. It hasn't gotten a ton of press. Some of that was me kind of preemptively saying, if you make hot take content about this, you probably don't totally get it, which I do think is...
Something I respect about you a ton is you are a true scientist in the truest sense of the term, and in the truest sense of like the definition of a scientist, such that you made an effort to go out of your way to say, this is probably not what you think it is. And if you make any content about it or talk about it, which is a good thing for you, generally speaking, for your work to get shared and discussed, you kind of like went out of your way to blunt that a little bit. So I'm curious your thought process behind that.
Yeah, I think mostly it came from the perspective of just like, I kind of reformat what it means to me about every 2 months, even though I've been literally thinking about this for the past 2 years.
Maybe take a step back for the listener. Reformat what? Just
like the way that I view the results ultimately. So
okay,
should I just like give a brief intro to what it was? So I mean, long story short, to try to keep it as brief as possible, my dissertation was basically all about the methods and the kind of ways we can ask questions about individual response variation. So put it even more practically, when I came into my PhD, you know, anytime you hear somebody talk about research, they're like, well, this only applies on average, right? You hear that caveat about pretty much everything. We care about having individuals, not on average. And
they heard that from you.
Yeah, 100%. So like, and that's kind of like for people who digest research-oriented content or like try to apply research, that's usually like kind of the sticker on it is like, yeah, this is cool, but it's not that helpful from a practical perspective. And so because of that, for my PhD, I really wanted to say, all right, well, I want to do something that is extremely practically useful. So how can I take these, you know, population average level concepts and get them more granular on the individual level. And that was kind of the genesis of my PhD. And I was very, very focused on, not only did I know that tons of variation in responses were a thing, my goal was to go 3 steps beyond that and try to find these practically relevant or ecologically valid predictors to try to help coaches have a kind of this dashboards of tools you can utilize to kind of predict the training program that's going to be best for an individual.
Zach's individualization algorithm.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least starting that. That was the dream, right?
100%. And I was like I said, like if you would have talked to me at the beginning of my PhD, it was less about like, if you're going to find anything, it was more so like which one of these things that I cooked up is.
Now I'm thinking back. It's okay. So we will do this topic. We'll do it at some point. I don't know if it's going to be later this month. I don't know if it's going to be October of next year. I don't know if someone's going to hold our feet to the fire and it's going to be multiple years from now and we got to revisit it. We're going to do it at some point.
Yeah.
We'll go through it thoroughly. But for now, I'm thinking back to, you obviously led the recruitment for those participants when data collection for that started, now multiple years ago, of course. But I played some role in recruitment, and I remember talking to some prospective participants for the study, and you kind of explain what you're researching, right?
Yep.
And I remember explaining it such that the goal is to be able to take kind of a panel of a participant or of a client or a patient or whatever the case may be, and be able to improve the starting point for their training intervention or their rehab intervention, right? That was kind of the general goal. Whereas I would, and I think you agree with this, would frame a study design like that, let alone the results, completely differently. So while you were talking, I just thought of how it's changed so much over the last however many years since we were recruiting for that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, yeah, exactly. That was basically how I viewed it too, is like, all right, I'm going to take an individual through this extremely comprehensive kind of testing battery or like panel, like you kind of mentioned, and with all that,
it sounds really cool.
Yeah, no, exactly. With all that information, we're gonna very conclusively decide, which type of a training intervention would be best, best suit your needs ultimately. And yeah, it is quite literally hilarious to think on the just how ambitious that was.
I hope you know what I mean right away when I say this. Your PhD, the primary dissertation project, failed in the absolute best way possible.
100%.
And but when I say failed, obviously I mean that like very loosely. Your your dissertation is really cool and really important. But it was not what you were thinking. So like 100%. I would say that is a huge success. But like in terms of the initial goal that you were just outlining, complete failure, but again, in the best way.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, so yeah, that was ultimately the intention, is like, all right, we're going to get this, and specifically I chose many of the predictors were what I considered ecologically valid predictors because I wanted coaches to be able to use them. So things like rep tests at 80% of 1RM, different other, biometric markers like body weight, VO2 max, like average step count, things like this. And like I said, it wasn't a matter of if I was going to find something, is which one of these cool things was going to tell us. And so, long story short, along the way in executing this study, proposing it, and ultimately defending my PhD, there's just so many things that go into researching variability that I don't think are well appreciated at this stage in the game. My PhD is one part of that. There's a couple of, pieces of work in kind of behind the scenes right now that hopefully will continue to kind of tell this story in a way that's even more comprehensive, hopefully, and get people, on the same page on just how challenging this topic is. That isn't to say we have conclusive findings by any means, but I think ultimately the way that I kind of have come out of this project thinking is that for the most part, like the null hypothesis should be, we're going to utilize things that we're confident in, which are going to be these population group-based level effects until we have a really, really good reason otherwise to expect that those won't work. Mm-hmm. And I think individual level program design for the most part is working around constraints rather than working with different principles or different rules. And I think that's...
Don't give them too much yet.
Yeah, I mean,
give them too much.
That's the long and short of it. There's so many like caveats and dips and turns and like specific practical applications.
I think a lot of I think how you have come to that broad conclusion, what it means practically, is really, really important. But I know that our audience will really value how you've come to that conclusion, and we definitely aim to do that at some point and present it in a way that's hopefully hopeful for other researchers and also the audience to the show, which is quite unique in the sense of their tolerance to listen to us yap about the nitty gritty. That doesn't seem practical on the surface, but I'm telling you, that project has like completely reshaped how I think about a lot of things, and I think it's really valuable for that reason. I think it's now pre-printed, and hopefully once you're on the other side of the publication process, you can talk more about that. But that's at least out there for public consumption. Is it on BioArchive?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's on BioArchive, which is another preprint server, and then you're obviously pursuing publication for it. So that's really exciting.
Joyful process as always.
Yeah,
getting people to understand. Yeah,
knock on wood, but like the volume meta, I mean, it was pre-printed a year ago now, and it's still in the review process, which I get it. Like there's important feedback, but anyway, the reason I bring that up is like that could be published tomorrow, or at least accepted for publication tomorrow. We could also have to start from square one tomorrow, and it could be another year, which is just wild to think about. So anyway, we don't need to get into pre-printing and all that good stuff right now.
I honestly see both sides of it. That's a controversial thing. That's a rabbit hole.
There's no like, I don't think we're in one specific camp, but that's just an interesting thing to think about. And I know you're going through that right now, but I think that project is going to have a really long tail in the sense that, is it going to be a super splashy finding right away or something that is like easy for people to make, and I'm pointing finger at us, an Instagram carousel post about it and discuss it. Like I think of like a volume paper that comes out, super easy to talk about.
That's
it
is hilarious thing. Yeah, that's the hilarious thing is that I've seen that on a few decisions. Is like the few times I've seen people try to talk about it is like, there's some confusing stuff here. Let's put that to the side and talk about the volume stuff, which I get it, but it's just it is a topic that deserves a fully fleshed out episode. Like you said, we'll do at some point, but it's
if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, Zach's dissertation was on individual responses to training, and they're saying that maybe that is not the right way to think about it. I'm really confused. I would say I understand. Again, 100%. Hang in there. We'll circle back at some point. But let me just give you a very basic example that's top of mind for me right now.
Sure.
And I'll quickly get your thoughts on that, and then we're going to nip this in the bud so we don't end up talking about this the whole time.
Yeah.
So right now, and I'm not going to speak too specifically about this because we're in the early phases of like looking at the data for a specific project, but in a separate project to what we were talking about with Zach's, we had within subjects design such that, just to make sure we're on the same page, one arm of each participant is in one group and then the other arm is in the other group, or the other condition, I should say. And we took multiple measurement sites and measurement methods. So we took biceps muscle thickness, which means you take the ultrasound probe, you put it on the middle of the bicep, and you look at how thick it is. We also did that same approach, muscle thickness, for the lateral head of the triceps and the long head of the triceps. So we have 3 muscle thickness values. We also have another way of measuring the size of the biceps. I'm not going to get into that right now. And we also just have a basic circumference measurement for the arms. Again, I'm not going to speak too confidently or specifically about that because we're in the early phases of looking at that data and making sense of it. And the groups don't even matter, but because we have multiple ways of looking at the same exact thing within the same person, you can basically say, oh, if they responded better to condition A, does that also hold up across all of the different measurement sites or across all of the different muscles that we measured? And the short answer is almost certainly no, because of just all of the sources of variation, or more simply, all the sources of noise that go into that. And in a lot of ways, I think that is the foundation to your dissertation and a point you want to make that's important for practitioners and for researchers going forward. So is that a fair example to get the appetite going for the audience? And if so, we can move on.
That is, it's funny because we haven't talked about this. That is exactly the phrasing and concept that I've consistently come back to, and like to simplify it as much as possible. Is basically my PhD was about really understanding how to define signal and how to define noise and separate those things. And I think that's it. Obviously, that's everything when trying to interpret data. And I think intuitively, it's, a lot of the time what we think is signal can get confused as noise and vice versa. And I think it's just depending on the question, depending on what you're trying to interpret, defining those things very clearly and understanding what could confound estimates of either one, I think that's the name of the game. But yeah, that's exactly the way that I've kind of consistently come back to, is like at the end of the day, what we do with data analysis is separating signal from noise, and that can be a trickier process depending on the research question than it may seem. So
for sure.
100%.
So with the exception of diving deep into that at some point, hopefully, one thing I think is worth saying on the front end, especially for the dedicated listeners, is that as a result of research we have going on, some other projects we'll talk about in the future, coaching, things like that, I think that the way that we're both viewing this podcast going forward, at least, I'm not saying forever, but at least in the near future, is that instead of saying, hey, we're going to prep for this podcast and spend a bunch of time doing that, which we have done, obviously some more than others, we're probably going to do that less. And instead, this podcast will draw from our work in those other areas that I mentioned, research we have going on, internal projects, our coaching practice that we maintain, and our personal experience, which I think has pros and cons, but I just, part of me is bummed about that, because I do really like for the volume and strength podcast, like I don't even know where to start in terms of adding up the hours of prep for that. And that was important to us, and I'm glad it's out there, but we're probably, just full disclosure, we're probably not going to be doing that anytime soon, with the exception of maybe the one we mentioned. So hopefully that's okay. And hopefully we're going to aim to be clear when we are, using specific references or talking confidently in our area of expertise versus more just kind of laid back training chat.
And I think it's important to maybe discuss why we think that is the case. Like, at least to me, and I think if you've listened to a lot of the episodes that we've done, in the last year or so, you've probably got the through line of like, we just don't view like the ESPN research ticker as like super productive really anymore. Obviously it's good to stay up to the evidence, and there's certain topics that kind of hedge new ground, and there's, if there's one study on a topic, that's really kind of all you have to go on. But I think for a variety of different reasons and a variety of different projects we've done or been a part of, that sense of being okay with uncertainty in certain areas and kind of waiting until we feel like we have a comprehensive look at a question area or whatever, like that's just kind of our vibe these days, honestly, like about pretty much everything. Is like, if I don't feel confident to look at something extremely comprehensively and be able to,
it's like, why do it at all?
Why do it? It's like, yeah, obviously you have to like, and maybe
stay up.
Yeah, maybe this is the biggest shift, is like, I think better than ever, we know what the data can't tell us. And so I think we have a really solid grasp on knowing when to leverage which legs of the stool of evidence-based practice. And I think that's really what it comes down to me. So like, for areas where that true comprehensive lens isn't possible or isn't available, or we just don't frankly feel good about it, I think we are more comfortable than ever realizing that like, hey, the data is there to derive us principles. And if that isn't sufficient in any case, that's okay, because we have other ways that we can try to form what we think is best practice based on coaching experience, common knowledge based on other coaches,
or just conjecture and extrapolation. And I think it's something I've always been mindful of, I think, but I know there's room for improvement of just being clear when that's the case.
Dude, this was a quote I heard on a podcast that I really, really liked. I think it was the Barbell Medicine podcast. They had Franco Impellizzeri on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but he's when the acute to chronic workload ratio stuff kind of really was in vogue. He and his group were the ones that were kind of pointing out some just issues, statistical issues, conceptual issues with that kind of a framework, and maybe overinterpreting it literally. And I really, really like. He had a
That sounds
quote.
like a good pod.
Oh, it's fantastic. He had a really, really good quote that I really liked, and it was, at the end of the day, as a practitioner or somebody who's kind of his perspective in kind of that applied sports science realm, he is much more comfortable when people just simply use experience or leverage their own beliefs rather than relying on weak evidence. And I think that was super, super good, because at the end of the day, I think that's where the science-based movement or the evidence-based PubMed warrior, like, I think that's where that negative tag comes in, is when, obviously, I think any person who can evaluate what science can give us objectively realizes the advantages of it, obviously. But I think somebody who is maybe kind of the, team science hashtag crowd doesn't equally admit is when the evidence is extremely weak or incapable of giving us a true comprehensive look. It may be lower quality in some cases or bias the perspective so much when the variance demon can't play out, right? That we've talked about before, that just simply relying on these other sources of evidence or other sources of data, I think, is something that's very important to not be afraid to leverage. And I really like that quote of like, leverage your experience when all you have is weak evidence, because weak evidence is still weak,
Yeah, I think that's a criticism. I've noted it internally. I don't know if I've said it publicly, is that that's like one of my biggest criticisms of evidence-based fitness since I've been like even just an outsider of it. And then once I kind of understand, like, okay, like I know the rest period research,
Yeah.
and not to use that as a specific example, but I think there's various topics where there is weak evidence, but science-based folks will use that weak evidence as like too strongly almost.
Yeah.
And I feel optimistic listening to what you said here, because I think that's where there's a lot of like confusion or maybe mistrust or lack of clarity in terms of science communication. And I think there's room for improvement there. So hopefully a long form show like this, you can kind of get an idea for what at least our perspective would be in terms of how to use research, which I don't know if I'm articulating that super well, but yeah, there's obviously like a pro-science crowd and there's an anti-science crowd, and that makes sense. It's probably always going to be the case. But I think there are flaws in science communication at large in the fitness space. I also think there's flaws in terms of the expectations for the anti-science crowd and what you can expect. And I think in a lot of ways, I hope that, our YouTube channel is tiny compared to the field in general, but hopefully we can be a very small force for good in terms of the anti-science crowd, if they happen to listen, understanding how these things can be really, really valuable, but you need to like know when they become valuable. Because, I just use the example of your dissertation and some of the projects we've done since we got to Florida Atlantic University and started our master's programs and subsequently PhDs. That stuff has completely changed the way I think about training, 100%. And I'm very passionate about that. At the same time, I'm very critical of the way some people use science. So I don't know. I hope we can help one or two people see that, and then that can kind of have a ripple effect.
Yeah, I think really, one of our, I don't know if I want to call it mission. That sounds a little bit weighty, but like something I feel passionate about now is like being a flashlight of like highlighting where, utilizing research is really well suited, and then areas where it's misapplied and kind of, I think people have, like you said, are kind of, it is almost like institutional distrust and like that kind of, area of things. And I honestly understand it, because it has also kind of been kind of this marketing weird kind of gig now too. And like, that's where, like I said, I do think it's like really, really important, particularly for people who do science communication and kind of want to be on like the helpful aspect of the pro research side of things, is like really look yourself in the mirror to some degree. And we had to do this too, because I think like anybody that's followed our content for a long time has seen the progression. Like we were, new study drops, the new I can like
I remember wanting to be the first one that saw a new study when it was
exactly. I remember when
put in a
the
journal.
Zaras cluster single leg press study was
Yeah.
published, and I'm getting the detail. Oh,
Yeah.
85% of one, and that strive of wanting to know the details and really comprehensively looking at things is obviously crucial for
Mhm.
proper research interpretation. But I do think that ticker, fast paced social media mindset to science communication has such clear downsides in the way that like
It's like almost anti-science.
exactly it's structurally interpreted inappropriately based on the way that the media rewards the
But
information.
yeah, and it's not it's so hard, man, because there are incentives and
And you also have to deal with like the net positive aspect too. Is like if somebody goes and I think I saw an infographic on the Mayo study the other day where it's like seated leg curls provide 1.5 times growth, and it's like yes, conceptually helpful. Yeah, I go back and forth. I'm like, sure, like that gets a principle out there that maybe is more efficacious on average. Like I can see how it's helpful, but at the same time, it's like yeah, it's hard. It's such a hard balance, and we're never one to throw rocks at glass houses because
so I hope it's not. I genuinely have not had any single person or persons or group in mind when pointing these things out.
mostly us and like
It's more so
in our
reflect.
progression.
So if you think we're talking about someone in particular, we're genuinely not.
No,
I also like sympathize so much with
because we've tried to wear
the
both hats.
tricky decisions you have to make, and the incentives, and people have employees, and like, and honestly, just talking about this, not to make it too deep, I'm very grateful for our audience.
Oh, 100%.
The fact that there are enough of you interested in whatever the hell we've just talked about for the last 27 minutes and are willing to put your trust in us if we have something to sell as well, so we can have a feasible business as well to make it make sense to
Keep doing it.
keep doing it. This microphone isn't free, that kind of thing. So anyway, it's tricky, and that's what drives us, because we do have a lot of other stuff going on, just to call a spade, but we're still making sure that this podcast is something we can continue to keep on our plate, because it's important for that reason. It's important to us for that reason. Okay. Any other updates for you?
No, I haven't got any new chairs or anything.
No new chairs.
No, unfortunately. That is on the list though. Like in the next year or so, I think I'm gonna upgrade, and it's gonna be. Oh, I finally got new deadlifting shoes.
Oh, because you were wearing those Nike soccer shoes
for a long time,
like 8 years.
Yeah, something like that. I have my squat shoes from maybe 2015. So 10 years on my squat shoes.
It's funny. I was walking into the gym yesterday with my Romelios, Nike Romelios. I think they're the 2s or the 3s. And the guy at the front desk was like, "Oh, the Romelios, those are the best." And I was like, "Oh yeah." And I was like, "You know what? I think this is the 10th year I've had them, and they're starting to fall apart a little bit." But I'm like, "That's pretty impressive."
Yeah, I think I might have to upgrade on those. Although I really like my shoes. But anyway, I got Notorious Lift shoes. I was gonna get the Avances ones you told me about, but they're sold out. So I got the Notorious Lift. They're like shoes, but they felt pretty good. So I was pretty pumped about that today.
I don't know about that specific one in particular, but the shoes for powerlifting have gotten way better.
They were really sticky. I like the grip was really nice. So yeah. No, I've been
I do want to get another pair of Avances, but I just cannot be bothered to like be ready at a certain time to make
that'll never happen. So
I'll make do. I do check their website pretty regularly if they have, because I have one of their
I
have one of their older versions.
Okay.
And then I'll see that they release something, and I'm not gonna like I'll just buy. I want to buy it when I'm ready. But to be clear, I have no problem. I totally understand why there's drops, there's hype, things like that.
Yeah, sure.
But anyway, all that is to say is Avances. Every time I go to your website, all of theirs in stock is like a size 4.
4.5.
Yeah.
4.5.
And I'm a 12, and I'm a Instagram DM away. if you need my address, and I'm happy to pay for them. I'm not asking for a free product. I know you have a 12 somewhere, and I'll take it, honestly, in whatever color, because I want to try your newest version. In my world, so the way that I generally work is I will have like little documents open for various projects or ideas, and it's like roughly organized, but I know where it is at any one time. And when I have a thought, I'm really big on just like jotting things down and then transferring it over to that document. So I kind of have like a starting point for when I know I'm going to like kind of turn to that project. And one of the projects I had for a while was just like overhauling coaching systems. And I got to the point where I had enough stuff in there of just like random thoughts, like, we need to change this. And when I say coaching systems, I mean like, what is the check-in process? How is communication structured? And then also a big part of that is like, how is the spreadsheet itself structured? And various downstream implications of that. Anyway, I had enough ideas jotted down and enough thought went into it. So anyway, that's how I work, is I get those ideas down, and then it kind of reaches a tipping point, and then once I'm focused on something, I can't focus on anything else but that thing until it's done. And then I end up getting really bad sleep for a few nights in a row, but I get it done, and I'm just like up at all, like, yeah, it's probably pretty unhealthy, but that's generally how I work. So I kind of go through these like various sprint phases, which I need to improve upon that. But anyway, I had a sprint phase recently with coaching systems where I just kind of like stripped everything down and rebuilt based on those changes. And I'd say since we started coaching, that was probably the biggest overhaul I've done since we started coaching, but it's probably the third time or so that we have done that. So all that is to say is that's an update for me. And I think any coaches out there appreciate how important systems are for not only like making sure you're not spending a bunch of time and energy on stuff that doesn't matter to improve your efficiency, but also to ensure you do get the stuff that does matter. And basically the way that I think about this, and I jotted this down before the show, is implicitly I designed the new systems for not only my personality type and what works well for me, but also what I now value as a coach these days, which is quite a bit different than when we set up the previous version of the system. And that's why I needed kind of that sprint phase. And I'm going to put these roughly in order in terms of the things that I now value as a coach. And I think that'll give you some insight into some of the things we talked about that have changed throughout the last few years based on new research, experience, etc. The first thing is precisely accounting for the individual's goals and values. Whereas I think in the past that was a discussion, but nothing that was as explicit.
Yeah.
And I think that is a super easy place in terms of room for improvement if you're like a new coach, for example. If you're a powerlifting coach, powerlifting means something different to a lot of different people, right? And I think just understanding that is really important. I set up this little like at least the way it looks is a grid, but if someone's goal includes muscle growth, which almost everyone does, be honest about it, every single muscle is listed, and then I have different columns that they check off for that muscle. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's something to the effect of like, I don't care, no preference, low priority, moderate priority, high priority, and then the last one is like something to the effect of such high priority that I want to emphasize this at the expense of other muscles. And just seeing that has been really helpful.
That's cool.
Because again, you think, oh, this client is interested in physique development, right? I'm going to give them a nice balanced physique program. Oh, they mentioned they really want to grow their pecs. I'll give them a couple extra sets there. Mm-hmm. But I think like, I just really value making sure we're steering the ship in the right direction based on their goals and also their values and how training fits within their life. Obviously, I'm not like proposing you go beyond your scope of practice and intervene in other areas of life, but understanding what their lifestyle is like and what, like, kind of getting a full peek behind the curtain for what drives the athlete, I think is really important. So that's number one, and better systems for that, not only upon onboarding, but long term, and kind of keeping those conversations going. The second is training execution. And notice how like actual program design hasn't been mentioned yet. This is higher than program design. So just ensuring I have good processes for training execution and keeping my suggestions for improving training execution top of mind while the athlete is training. That was something that I prioritized in the new systems. Third is just general motivation and desire to train, which is not something we need to optimize for, but I think it's important to monitor because I think it can help you get ahead of when those goals or values are shifting, which is inevitable. I have plenty of people that started interested in powerlifting or physique development and it flipped because we've had discussions about it. And a lot of times I can kind of get an idea when that's starting to creep up. And then also just kind of getting ahead of any potential challenges and knowing when I can push them, when I can pull them back. The fourth is lifestyle and goal alignment. So what I mean by that is ensuring that training fits within their life and not the other way around. And ensuring that what we're doing is sustainable. So just as like a basic example, if I know someone's goals include that, like it requires them to gain weight. Something that I'm asking now on the front end is a confidence indicator of if your goal is to gain weight, how confident are you that you can execute that goal? So it's like no confidence, low confidence, moderate confidence, high confidence. And that can give you a lot of good insight into like, if I ask them, if I suggest that they go in this direction with body weight or with tracking their sleep, how do I expect this to kind of impact their
Based
lifestyle?
on skill, almost.
Yeah. And how is that therefore going to impact the sustainability of what we're doing and impact their lifestyle at large? And then the last thing, don't get me wrong, this is still important, but the last thing I have on my list is program troubleshooting. I still think that's really important, and we're going to get into that in the next segment where we answer listener question. And I do have systems for program troubleshooting, but it is not necessarily the focus of the coaching process. And in a lot of ways, you have to tick a lot of boxes to like graduate to that point, in my view. And we'll get into that in a little bit, like because when you need to troubleshoot a program, I think you need to be in a really good position to be ready to do so. But in a lot of ways, if those other things I just mentioned beforehand are not taken care of, like program troubleshooting it's a non-starter. Yeah. It doesn't matter. So anyway, hopefully that is some food for thought for the coaches out there, or is interesting for the lifters out there. But that is something that I kind of made a push on recently, and I'm really pleased with where it's at right now. Maybe in the future, if there's interest in the comments or whatever, we can talk about those specific systems, because I think, again, some coaches that listen might be interested in those sorts of things for idea fuel for themselves, and maybe I can even show you guys around that sort of thing. But I think that leads us nicely into the first listener question, unless you have any input, feedback, reflections.
Ultimately, your kind of training system overhaul has been much more explicit in terms of altering systems and things like that. I guess for me, the biggest thing that's just been a shift for me, which is on very similar lines ultimately, but maybe a little bit more conceptual in nature, and how I've handled the coaching process has just been literally the entire initial investment in the coaching relationship is just building what we call training skill, but it means a lot of things. It means effective communication strategies when your goals or your motivation or your situation has changed. It means how to handle training sessions where your performance is way less, or you're having flares of chronic injuries, or whatever that is. It is how to approach week 2 of a 4-week block before competition. You know what I mean? Like all of these things that are, even if the training program is the exact same, if you flip all of these things to be negative decisions, not only does that harm you in the short term, but in my view, number one, the thing that's going to allow you to actually reach your potential is staying in the game long enough and having training skill that allows you to kind of ride the wave of all these things that inevitably change over the long run. If you do not invest in really building and developing that skill early on, then you're like grinding your nails across a chalkboard every time you have to do that, as opposed to kind of like just accepting a little bit of this I don't want to call it lack of control, but it's just like understanding how to be flexible in these situations, and just building that skill set and that mindset and that ability has gone such a long way in so many clients that I've had, and all in kind of different ways. Like one of them has been kind of emotionally and mentally overcoming what it feels like to go through chronic injuries and kind of climb back to past strength levels. Some of them have been how to deal with the fact that I want to PR my total, but I simply, from my lifestyle scenario, I cannot reasonably expect to do that right now. How do you handle that mentally? How are you making progress in that way? How do you go about the training?
How are you motivated to train?
How are you motivated to train in those scenarios? Like, and that's important because if we don't attack that with the right mindset, we're never going to be able to hold on to where we're at to be able to attack to hit that next PR, right? And then vice versa for people who are kind of on this active climb and it's less of a kind of a hold back mentality and it's more of a push forward mentality. How do I align the decisions that I'm making to not be too aggressive on certain days? Or how do I make sure that I'm, leaving enough in the tank or executing my training correctly to make sure I can get the most out of this or actually match with the intent of what's on the paper? Like, I could go on and on about it, but like to me, every single year that I coach, I am more bought into the things that are not on the training log than the things that are.
Yeah.
And I think the strike zone for effective training programs in the vast majority of scenarios is way wider than people think. And the execution and the training skill associated with performing that training program is the thing that separates you from making progress, particularly in the long term. So I'm 100% on the same page with you. And yeah, I it's so not a sexy answer, but I genuinely think, yeah, that is literally what long-term training progress is to me, is just becoming very intimately aware with that training skill aspect of things, and for yourself, understanding what you need from that perspective on things to keep taking steps forward, whatever that looks like in that stage of life. Ultimately.
Right. It's like a little bit less about am I low volume, high intensity, and a little bit more about like, hey, I know you had that work trip. How'd you manage nutrition during that time period? Or like, how were you flexible with your training to the degree that you needed to be? So like a basic example that comes to mind is literally going through someone's situation of like, hey, can you let me know the hotel you're staying at? And I'm going to kind of walk you through, if I was in your shoes, how I would look for a gym. And, okay, you're not going to have a car. Let's see if there's one of them.
Skill.
Right. And then like you need to walk them through that and make that investment once or twice.
Yep.
And then they're good. Right. And then it's like, oh, this person's progressing a lot better.
It has downstream implications. Cause now it's like, I know what to do when I'm traveling, but also now
I know what the goal is.
Exactly.
I know it doesn't really matter if I'm, just like a basic nutrition example is like, I know it doesn't really matter if I'm not at home in order to still move in the right direction. Yep. But like, I also know if I am tracking my nutrition or I have a specific calorie target, which isn't always required, but even though I have a specific calorie target or a calorie range, that's whatever, plus or minus 100 calories, I know that that's really just to optimize the rate as opposed to anything magical about that. So I know that if I'm dieting and my target is 2,300 to 2,500 calories, and it just shakes out that I only got 2,700 calories. Okay, I'm still moving in the right direction, just at a slower pace. Will it slow me down? Sure, but is it a big deal? No. And am I still going to be confident to get back on the horse when I get home? Like those things I think matter a hell of a lot more than like, again, am I a low volume or high volume guy or 100%. For this lift? Like
100%.
I just think I've always known those things matter, but not intervening, but just making them more top of mind.
Yeah. And it's not to say that programming troubleshooting isn't obviously a really important part. It is. But to me, that part of things is 1 million times more potent when you've actually invested in all the other things, because now we can make really, really intentional changes that are actually, you're just coming back to what we said earlier. You are able to separate signal from noise so much more because you're confident the intention and everything is being executed appropriately because you spent the time on the front end to really dive in and build that training skill to make sure you're on the same wavelength.
And just, I don't know why it's bothering me and I need to say this, but I know I listed a lot of things there. A big part of it was also making sure that what I'm asking of the lifter is very reasonable and sustainable, because I know a lot of people don't like having to sit down at the end of a week and type out a long piece of feedback,
100%.
but then you also need that reflection time. So I found this really cool tool that just allows someone to record themselves and then directly upload it to basically an inbox for me. So that was also top of mind. So I know I listed a lot of stuff there, but I also made it. The goal is to make all this stuff sustainable and easy to track. So
it's higher fidelity information, not necessarily more.
exactly. Yeah, that's absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, so that leads us into a question from Lionel. And Lionel sent this question through email. So if you aren't subscribed to our newsletter, go ahead and do so. And it'll prompt you to ask us some questions. And I highly value the email questions because I will actually manage them because they're in my inbox, and all the ones you guys have asked through Instagram question box, I don't know where they are. I apologize. But join the newsletter. Basically, Lionel asks about how to make sense of training data. More specifically, he asks, the biggest problem I'm having is how to make sense of the years of data I've produced. No style of programming seems to work more than once, and when I try to do it again, it just doesn't seem to work very well. At the core of this question is like, okay, let's say you have been really diligent about logging your training, which I think most people are, or at least to some degree, or like whatever, they've followed various programs. How do I make sense of that, right? You think about individualizing your training and finding what works for you. What do you do with that data? I've seen it all, honestly.
Done it all
As well. I've had people submit to coaching inquiries, like I think the tool's called Tableau, where it's like they took the CSV and they made a bunch of data visualizations, and that stuff is cool. But I'm curious, Zach, like I definitely have some thoughts on this question, but I'll let you kick us off here. Where does your mind go when you think of someone that has 5-10 years of training data?
Yeah, I mean,
how do you make sense of that?
So it always is an ironic answer every time we tackle this topic, because I think, again, when we started this, I think we were very much of the mindset of like, if you track enough things, if you know what to track, if you look at things correctly from a data and metric perspective, you're going to be able to get this kind of golden approach and golden information that you can distill down into essentially taking the decision-making process off of the coaches or athletes' hands and kind of externalizing that, keeping it entirely objective. And we're in this Goldilocks land of like, as long as I record all my information and are diligent with recording everything, I can kind of just trust that this, in the forest of the data, there will be an answer. Mm-hmm. And I think the more that I've done this, and also the more that we've got experience in research and understand how challenging it is to come to inferences when you have highly controlled laboratory data with many people, and how challenging it is to come to comprehensive inferences in that case, my confidence in, and we've talked about the kind of the paradox of knowing how little control we really have as coaches or athletes and kind of what we're doing versus kind of how you have to act. And I think that is important. Like, we have to try to make adjustments to our training. We have to act as if what we're doing does have control and agency over the situation. So I acknowledge that. But I do think that, like, a lot of the times, the amount of confidence that you can distill from a training log like this, I think, is overstated for quite a few reasons. Number one is just the ability to separate signal from noise and cause and effect. Particularly when you're looking at your own individual data, there's just so many confounding things that you're just fundamentally not able to separate unless you do things in an extremely, extremely specific way, which I know how to set those things up, but the assumptions and things that you're kind of baking in a training context, I think, are essentially never safe. So just as a basic example, I run a training program today. I run a training program 5 years later. Fundamentally, I'm not the same person. I'm not the same athlete. The training that preceded that intervention may be different. I may be stronger. I may have a different life context. The list goes on and on and
on. My training data, when we had the busiest years of data collection, or there were semesters that were just, the schedule was wild and unpredictable. Mm-hmm. even if I did have that stuff perfectly formatted in a certain spot, I just like, I know that's useless. I was like, there were times where I was training at just the weirdest hours of the day on super weird sleep schedule. Nothing was consistent. That's just a basic example.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's just like, I think that is hard for people to accept. Like, humans just don't deal with uncertainty very well. But
Mhm.
ultimately, like, I do think it's just fundamentally challenging, even with diligent individual level data collection, to truly separate cause and effect. And what I mean by that is the training program changes that you think are driving changes in performance or lack thereof. I think that drawing that arrow consistently and being very confident that that's a causal arrow is just a very, very challenging problem. So that's basically what I'm saying there, is that it's not that training data is useless by any means. I think that can be directionally helpful. I think that can be, if there's obvious things in terms of what direction maybe makes sense, sure. But I do think that any process in which you're trying to take somewhat of an art in essentially taking what we believe to be principles and some degree best practices of application and trying to make that an entirely objective process, I ultimately think does kind of steer you in the wrong direction in a lot of ways. So here's kind of how I view training data is, for the most part, I view it as the data kind of has a shelf life, is the first thing I'd say, is that yes, there is value in kind of taking very long-term, data collections of things and having training logs for years and years and years. I don't think that's entirely useless, but I view it more so from like a, when I hit a plateau or something like that, and I'm looking for maybe some inspiration or maybe, some directional nudges on which place to head, I think that can be useful. But for the most part, I view, and we talked about this in a few places, and I'm kind of going in circles, so if I need to bring it back, let me know. But for the most part, I view training as relatively input based these days, for the most part. And what I mean by that is we have principles that we believe kind of are our best comprehensive understanding on how training works. And then you have like these artistic applications of those principles and logical extrapolations on how to adjust those things in the evolving life context that you have in your kind of day-to-day life. And I honestly think combining those two things is kind of the way that you derive your best bet in terms of what you should do.
Yeah.
And so if you're not making progress and it seems like a training program doesn't work more than once, that very well could be the case in what you've observed. I'm not disputing that. But why is that the case is an entirely different question that is extremely, extremely challenging to answer. And so to me, in absence of better evidence, that I think is going to be a really long
You
time.
need more time.
Yeah. In absence of better evidence, before we have more complicated ways of dealing with these types of questions, there'd just be like a lot of things I would run through to kind of get some more context on that situation. But I've been talking for a while, so I'll let you go.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that the training style doesn't actually work twice. That just isn't really a thing in my experience. I think back in the day, there's, like a big, why am I blanking on like the phrase?
Biological accommodation,
Yeah.
muscle confusion,
Adaptive resistance.
Yeah,
That's
there you
it.
go. Nice.
Adaptive resistance.
Nice.
I just don't really think that's a thing.
Yeah.
I mean that it might be on the margins. There might be like a psychological component
That's
to it.
exactly what I was gonna say.
If you had like a really good block that was heavy, happened to be a heavy block, you might be able to run it back one time. But if you try to run it back a third time, your body's gonna start screaming at you. Like I would say for like a third of the powerlifters I work with, I would never run like the general block approach we know works pretty well for them. I would never run it probably more than twice in a row, just because even if it's just psychological, like I just have it just doesn't go well. Aches and pains start to creep up, things like that. So I do think that's kind of on the artistic side of things, but ultimately, just from like a conceptual basis, I think what Zach and I are circling around is that training data is important, but it's not necessarily the driver of the process in terms of designing effective training. I don't think I think it's unlikely that there's a training style that is necessarily best for someone, but instead you can pick up on hints or inspiration about how to best apply goal-specific principles for that lifter. So, for example, especially if it's a newer lifter and we don't have much training data, we don't have much to go off of, and one of their lifts is not moving well, I'll say, hey, do you have any old training logs from when things did progress well? And I'll use that as inspiration. Of course, if that training log was from 6 years ago, I might put less stock into the one from 2 years ago. But it can definitely help serve as inspiration about how to best apply the principles to that individual. So basically what we're suggesting is you should shift your mindset to your mindset should not necessarily be what style of lifting is best for me. Instead, your mindset should be, how can I apply the principles within my constraints? And that can kind of give rise to what seems like a training style, but I don't think there's some magic fairy dust about that training style for the individual.
Yeah.
And I think just shifting that perspective from, again, what's the training style I need, to how do I apply the principles within my constraints, that's just going to give you such a running start for programming going forward, as opposed to kind of this weird, awkward thing of trying to find this elusive program design that's best for you.
That's exactly how I think about it. Is like, at the end of the day, I don't think there's a training program that someone would respond best to in every scenario. Like that's the part of things I tend to question. Like, if we had somebody, had two twins that were in the exact same, context, environmental constraints, etc., probably gonna do the same program. That's a bad example because they're twins, but maybe they're not twins, but they're extremely similar in terms of all the biometric ways, like height, leverages, things like that. And then they're in the exact same environmental context. I think you're probably going to abide by the principles in very similar ways in both those cases. But if you change the environmental context of one of those two individuals, that probably is going to have some downstream implications on the training program that seems to result in the most progress. And I think those are the things that people tend not to track, which I think is hilarious. Is like, it's almost like you're tracking the symptom and not the cause in a way. Is like, if people were more diligent about like really detailing the environmental context in which they're trying to train,
tracking body weight, but
it's just exactly. There's just so many things about like that's the type of thing that I think it helps you interpret your training data probably more accurately, I guess, is the way that I view it. And in absence of that, if you're just looking at the X's and O's of the training program and how you would progress, I think that can be quite misleading in terms of whatever is going to be the most beneficial. But I view things very similar to you. Is if somebody comes to me and they have a detailed training history, obviously I'm going to utilize that. But the way that I almost view that is like, okay, this is kind of an objective look at how their context is kind of informing their training and what they have found to be the most successful. I don't view it as like, all right, they have 8 sets and they have SSB on the second day, so I have to do that. I don't view it like that at all. It's more, okay, how much is their external load or external environmental load influencing things, and kind of how does that end up manifesting?
Why did SSB tend to lead to better performances?
Exactly.
Sure, SSB is a tool that could get the job done, but there's nothing, necessarily special about it. There's multiple roads to Rome. Your job as a coach is to take one of those roads to Rome. Make sure you don't like get off track in terms of trying to get to Rome, if I try to continue with this analogy. But understanding the principles that underlie the fact that 8 sets with SSB on the secondary day is what permitted a positive result, not necessarily trying to find 8 sets in SSB.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Every time we talk about this, it is one of those things where it's like, it is hard to fully describe this without having that comprehensive resource of like kind of an updated look at individualization. Every time we talk about this, I feel bad that we don't have that, because that is important, and that's something I want to like run through a couple scenarios on like how we used to view it, how we view it now, and like just kind of comparing and contrasting those things, because it sounds so obvious when we say it, but it is a conceptual shift.
Let's make it practical for the people at home. When thinking about this question, again, the training data doesn't necessarily drive the process, but it is very important. It's still key part of the process is what I'd say. It's like, I'm kind of speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but hopefully the listener's picking up what I'm putting down. So again, let me acknowledge, again, just to be clear, program troubleshooting, training data, it's all important stuff. But what am I actually valuing? Perhaps that's helpful for the listener to hear. So let's start with strength-oriented goals, and then let's talk about hypertrophy-oriented goals. So for a power lifter, the way that I like to think about this is like, I'm going to assess the inputs and I'm going to assess the outputs. Of course, in terms of inputs, you could come up with hundreds of variables, but like, what are the key inputs that I think are actually going to like drive the response or the effectiveness or lack thereof of a program? To me, there's 4 key things that I'm kind of keeping an eye on. The first is SBD frequency. So I do think that's like one of the most important things to individualize is like, is it sufficient for this person to bench twice a week, or do they need to consider benching 3, 4, or 5 times a week? The next is exercise selection. We've talked about that quite a bit. I think that's where true individualization almost certainly occurs. And that is largely because different people have different proportions and different quote unquote weaknesses and different things that limit their strength. So therefore exercise selection is very important, especially for those accessory lifts that are there to kind of build up the athlete and ultimately drive up their top end performance. The third input is, and I'm stealing this phrase from other folks, it's definitely not my phrase, is pacing, which I think some people are going to cringe at that a little bit. And I do too, but I do think it's something that I'm individualizing quite a bit these days. So let's talk about frequency, for example. Generally speaking, I think higher frequencies, all things held equal, are a bit better. Obviously, it needs to be somewhat sustainable. But a nice way to make a higher frequency sustainable is to change the pacing throughout a block. For example, if you have someone that's having a hard time tolerating even 3 times per week benching, what you can do is you can have them bench 3 times per week, maybe adjust the loads and the exact sets and reps and the target RP or whatever the case may be. But you can also adjust the peaks and the valleys throughout a 4-week block or an 8-week block or a 12-week block, right? So for example, you could kind of do an exponential approach where, yes, you're benching 3 times per week, but for most of the block, you're hanging out at lower RPs, and then you're kind of having that exponential rise at the end of the block. I do think that's pretty important. I do pay quite a bit of attention to it these days. The last input is periodization. And I don't think this is any like fancy schmancy phase potentiation, counteracting, adaptive resistance type stuff. I really just think of it as like, what is the flavor of the block? What is the emphasis? And what is the sequencing of that? So for example, if there's a really good peaking type block for an individual, you probably can't run that 4 times in a row because you're just going to drive them into the ground. So those are the inputs. Again, SBD frequency, exercise selection, pacing, and periodization. Now, what are the outputs in order to assess the effectiveness of those inputs? It's performance, right? For strength-oriented folks, it's performance. That makes sense. Of course, you need to contextualize that within like the body weight that they're at, that sort of thing. But I view it as the performance ceiling and the performance floor. So let's start with the performance floor. The performance floor is just kind of like it's a little bit more subjective. It's like, how are things generally feeling most days, and what could that individual hit on any given day for a triplet 8, whatever, right? So maybe a week 1 or a week 2 performance within a block. So when the RPs are a little bit lower, that can give us some indication about what the floor is. But probably what's most important, and I think you can really, in a lot of cases, isolate it down to the performance ceiling. What is the rep PR that you were able to achieve by the end of the block? Or, even if it's like an RP8 or a 9 set, what were you able to hit for a triplet 8 or triplet 9 when you're really kind of going for broke and trying to put up a nice performance? You could translate that over to an estimated 1RM, so you could compare that across blocks. So you have these inputs, you have the output. The output, I think, can be consolidated. I don't think you need to super nitty-gritty track every single little detail. But if you have high fidelity outputs of performance, again, mostly prioritizing the performance ceiling, keeping an eye on the performance floor, that's where you can say, okay, bench is plateaued. Let's look back to when bench moved well. What were the inputs? And do I still think those inputs apply? And if so, how am I going to move towards those inputs again? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I largely agree. Yeah, I'm trying to think about anything different and novel I can say.
I can move on to hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I tend to agree. I think, yeah, just go on. I don't have too much to add. I was really trying, but just go to hypertrophy.
No, you're good. But do you generally, in a lot of ways, I've consolidated the key output I'm looking for a strength athlete is like, what are they hitting for their heaviest set of the block for SBD?
I was just gonna say the only thing I'd consider on this in terms of something that I've changed quite substantially is just the time scale, which I think these things can be
Oh, that's true.
evaluated.
You're not going to make any sweeping conclusions after 8 weeks of
Yeah.
training or like comparing one
Particularly
block
as
to
you get
another.
more advanced, like these things, like that's what, and it really just all comes down from the perspective of like, what can we ascertain from this information in this period of time with all these things running in the background? Like, there's just so many things that can limit our ability to derive confident conclusions from this stuff. So I from an outputs perspective, I am 100% on board with this, but I do give the cake quite a long time to bake these days,
Yeah.
and I'm much more willing to manipulate the inputs a little bit based on subjective information while that cake is baking.
Yeah.
And I just don't feel like beholden to like this combination of
We can't touch the cake while it's baking.
Yeah, like I just don't believe those things anymore. Like I feel
Like, oh man, you know what? I should have added more vanilla extract to the cake. Go add vanilla extract to the cake.
exactly. Yeah, and I don't think we have a granular enough picture of what's actually happening for that to distill things very much. Like in my mind, there's like very large scale dosage changes that's kind of in one bucket, and then little seasoning things and stuff like that like I don't view that as like fundamentally changing things
Right.
like the way that I used to. Like the version of me now kind of thinks it's silly when I think about like going from like a pause squat to a tempo squat. Like, dude, it like that just yes, of course, I realize that is an important change, and that could have some things that the athlete perceives as important, but like it's not that.
Especially if you're not like using pause squat to target something. Like for example,
right?
You could use a pause squat to emphasize a certain cue, but you could probably also emphasize that cue with tempo squat.
Yeah.
But pause squat might be a slightly better tool for the job. Or pause squats I know are really helpful for people that are taller.
Yeah.
And have a hard time getting to depth.
Yeah.
Right. So there are times when a pause squat might be better than a tempo squat, but a lot of times they are interchangeable if there isn't like a specific thing you're targeting with it.
100%. Yeah. And so really like, and the other thing I was just gonna say is like I think a lot of things are psychological, and I think that's okay. Like I think people downplay psychological things, but like one thing I think is interesting. I haven't thought about it enough to like make very strong claims about it, but I honestly think that like it's like the single at 8 craze, like that kind of thing, versus kind of the whole 6, 7, 8, 9 RPE kind of phase now. I kind of think they're the same thing, but the latter is just more tolerable from a psychological perspective because it kind of guarantees that you're going to add weight every week.
It's artificial progression, bro. We talked about artificial progression
a long time ago, but it's basically just taking the same average RPE and just spreading it out.
Yeah.
And so it's long story short, I think there's a lot of things like that that are more psychologically tolerable.
I do think the vibes of 6, 7, 8, 9 are way better.
Way better. And I'm with that 100%.
So don't get me wrong.
Oh, no.
I'm joking.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Psychological things are like viewed negatively, but I don't think I don't think they should be, because like to me, again, at the end of the day, if we're just zooming all the way out, we are doing very, very monotonous training for a long time.
Yeah.
So like any way we can make that process more engaging, more tolerable, more sustainable, I'm all for that, because I think that helps the cake bake for longer doing a similar thing so we can get high fidelity information once again. So it's like, again, I'm totally inputs based. I think that is extremely helpful way to think about it. I think that gives the coach and the athlete more freedom on adjusting to things that they think are going to be high leverage changes subjectively in the immediate term. And I also think it gives you the epistemic humility to actually say, what can we ascertain from this on the back end, letting things kind of develop for a long period of time. And I think most people kind of get that these days. Like, I think that is the kind of the general consensus, and people tend to think about it that thing. Although I still don't think we totally have conceptualized what we mean by input space, and I think we'll do a comprehensive episode to get that across at some stage. But
so for hypertrophy, the inputs in my mind, I really consolidated it down quite a bit. There are some, I want to be clear, there are some assumptions here, because like something I just do these days because I think it's the right thing to do, but I could also be convinced otherwise, is like I mentioned SBD frequency, but I didn't mention SBD volume. Reason being is, I mean, if you look at the evidence for those variables, volume and frequency, and their effect on strength, frequency seems to have more of a direct relationship with strength. But I do still think volume is important, of course. It's just that per session volume is relatively static or like relatively consistent. Am I going to change that at times? For sure. Especially like in an off season, if there's lower frequency, I might crank up the per session volume. But like that's kind of where I just like assume the way the block shakes out. Like I made it good is just like the simplest way to put it. So same idea here with hypertrophy is that I'm like probably never gonna program more than 4 or 5 sets for an exercise. And if I'm going to, like, I honestly can't think of the last time I programmed 5 sets for an exercise.
Me too.
I'm gonna program maybe 1 at times, but for the most part 2 to 4.
Again, psychological thing, right?
Yeah,
Like that, like
even if I want someone to do 8 sets of biceps in a session, I'm just gonna give them multiple exercises, even if there's no really great reason to, because that sounds terrible.
Yep.
So anyway, keep that in mind, is that like this is just within the constraints of like a reasonable per exercise or per session volume, things like that. So I think for hypertrophy, man, the main inputs I can really kind of boil it down to is when I look back at the program, what was the priority muscle or muscles, if at all? Was it a completely balanced program, or were we really biasing quads in the sense that we were training them twice a week, and then we also had some leg extensions and sissy squats on a third day, and they were put early in the session, and therefore it had probably some downstream consequences on the quality of the rest of the session. So again, priority muscle or muscles, if at all. And secondly is the number of exercises for that muscle. Because generally speaking, if I'm going to push the workload on something, if I'm going to push the volume or frequency on a muscle, I'm probably going to also, it's also going to coincide with the number of exercises they're doing for that muscle.
And volume, if you're keeping that relatively static.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. So those are really the inputs. It's like, what was the general bias of the block in terms of muscles, and how many exercises do we do? And those are really the main inputs for hypertrophy.
Do you go, granted, I don't coach too many physique oriented people, so I'm honestly just curious. Do you go above 3 times a week frequency for very many things these days?
I can't tell you the last time for hypertrophy only.
Yeah.
Maybe lateral delts. There would be like a 4th day.
Yeah.
But like I would probably rather just have 2 lateral raises.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a benefit.
Yeah.
Volume equated.
Yeah. No, I mean, I honestly,
I do think going from 2 to 3 is a nice lever to pull.
I do too. I frankly, it just gives you more space. Like that's the way I've always thought about it. Yeah. But the thing I was going to say here is like kind of using the hypertrophy information to talk about powerlifting just a little bit more. I don't know if you are going to know what I mean when I say this, but hopefully it comes across. For like high level bodybuilding training, and I'm mostly thinking like enhanced, like kind of in that realm. Do you like get the vibe that like training is just kind of a checkbox where it's like we're doing pull today and we're going to blast it and train really hard? That's really all we kind of need to say about it. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
There's sufficient stimulus.
Yeah, it's just, but like that's really all they talk about it. Like when you like bodybuilders, the thing I find interesting.
That's basically what I just said.
No, for sure. But I guess the thing that's super interesting is like, to me, that's been the case for bodybuilding for a long time.
And then if they got feedback from judges or whatever, then they might
add an exercise here.
Or like if it's a pull day, back and bicep day, they might do an extra 2 back movements.
Yeah, but for bodybuilding, it's not like this, like, get out your calculator. Like, it never really has been that. And obviously, you can take that too far. But my point with that is powerlifting is a completely different mindset. And I think they can learn something from that.
I think both can learn from each other.
For sure. And I think it's usually not in the direction of bodybuilding going to powerlifting. It's usually in the other direction. And what I'm saying is, like, I think those individuals have a probably unknowingly, but I think they have a good kind of scope on the degree to which that really plays a role, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if I'm articulating what I mean.
I think I'm picking up where you're...
It's just like, all right, SBD frequency's in a good spot. We're fatigue, train hard.
We're good.
And it's I think that is often not appreciated. And I think that could be
For sure. Yeah.
more useful.
And then like, I think you can take that approach. So like, especially for someone that's just getting into powerlifting, I think you could say like SBD's frequency is in a good spot. I'm recovering on time most of the time. I'm able to perform pretty well. I'm progressing pretty well. I'm happy with that. I don't think you need to get into the fancy schmancy 6, 7, 8, 9 blocks. But once you get to the point where it's like, okay, SBD frequency is in a good spot, but I'm getting so beat up from training that I can't progress week to week, then you use a block structure
Absolutely.
sort of thing.
That's like feedback from the judges.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think inputs for hypertrophy can be pretty simple, and it's really just like obviously and then I think there's no way to say like, oh, I had this exercise in. I take that back a little bit. You could make like meaningful changes to your exercise selection approach. So like I've heard the example of, someone tries lengthened partials for the calves, and then they see their calves grow. So that would be an input, but that would have to be like a pretty like wholesale change to what you're doing.
Yeah.
I
think exercise selection matters for hypertrophy as an input too.
But like 100%, I think it's like probably the most important thing. Like exercise execution is the most important thing. But like to me, you do that no matter what.
Sure.
So that's kind of that's probably a helpful clarification is like I'm talking about retroactively looking at training data. When I'm retroactively looking at training data, what do I care about?
Okay, I see what you're saying now.
Of course, I always care about the exercise selection and the execution. I think you should just always optimize that the absolute best you can at all times, no matter what. This is when you're retroactively, I'm in a rut, things are moving well.
Got it.
The outputs I'm going to look at to determine you're in a rut or you're at a plateau is I'm going to look at your physique, right? I'm going to look like a really simple thing you can do is body weight plus a waist measurement, right? If you track that over a long enough time period, you can ensure that at a given body weight, your waist measurement is either the same or ideally lower, so you're holding more muscle mass. I think that's actually a pretty dang sensitive measure in my experience. And then also standardized photos are really helpful as well. Same body weight across 14 months apart, whatever the case may be, that's your indication that you're moving in the right direction. And then I think the outputs to ensure happening over a long time period are like rep PRs in the gym with a certain standardized execution. Does have to happen week to week? No, but I do think week to week progression is helpful to ensure that like you're not completely crushed by the training and it's sustainable, that sort of thing. So that kind of week to week progression ensures you're in a reasonable workload range, and then long-term rep PRs ensure that you are sufficiently adapting positively to the training. And then if that's, again, not the case, whether you're not hitting rep PRs over a long time period or your physique photos at a given body weight are not improving, or at a given body weight, your waist circumference is going up, then we look at those inputs, right? We say, okay, maybe the balance of the training program is off, or maybe we do just need to train with higher volumes or lower volumes or whatever the case may be. And then that's when you look at the inputs. But again, exercise selection and execution, you should always be working from a principle-based perspective to optimize those. That's how I think about troubleshooting for hypertrophy training.
Yeah, no, that makes more sense now when you put it that way. Yeah, I'm in total agreement.
All right, so we have about, let's call it 15 minutes. I have a proposition for you. Let's set a timer for 5 minutes for each of these 3 things. Does that sound good?
I'm setting the timer right now.
Setting the timer.
Tell me when to go.
Okay.
You ask it, then I'll start it.
No, you got to start it right now. Otherwise, we'll run out of time. Right. Start the first 5-minute timer.
3, 2, 1.
All right. So in this segment, we're going to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain for things that we think are really valuable to understand from a scientific perspective as it pertains to practical application in the gym, but that we don't have good answers to right now. And I think by doing this exercise, you're going to get some indication about things we do have some confidence in, and also just generally how we view the role of science. Notice how in these upcoming 3 big remaining questions in training science we're going to go over, notice how there's not is 10 or 15 sets per week better. It's not is 60 seconds between sets enough. That's not really the role of science in our opinion. We think of it more principle-based and giving us the mental framework to allow the art of training or the practice of training and just that practitioner skill, that lifter skill to really shine. So the first of our 3 big remaining questions in training science is, does fatigue harm your ability to elicit a hypertrophy stimulus. So, just generally speaking, there is little evidence of overtraining within typical study durations. In fact, when you try to elicit true, like kind of overtraining syndrome, which could be roughly defined as there being so much training stress that you see a decrement in your performance and maybe even like some psychological issues or injuries that also occur, and ultimately that performance doesn't come back for several weeks or months. That's hard to do, okay, even in pretty extreme programs, right? Also, we see that for hypertrophy training, higher volumes generally seem to lead to better outcomes. Training to failure generally leads to better outcomes. We don't see this clear indication that you do too much and then you get really screwed over, is basically what it comes down to. But at the same time, we roughly know you need to recover from training. You need to not necessarily overdo it. So to me, there's kind of this fundamental question that we need to examine is like, from a physiological, muscular perspective, how and when can fatigue actually impact your ability to elicit a hypertrophy stimulus? Are you generally following that big research question?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think depending on who you ask, they would have different opinions on the degree to which that's settled. But yeah, to me, that you can point to outcome evidence that could kind of give you indications in kind of multiple different directions there. You mentioned the volume data. You also have like things like intensity techniques that inherently accumulate fatigue at a faster rate, which impairs your performance, which in theory should lead to worse outcomes. And again, you could look at that data from multiple perspectives. On average, like drop sets, for example, usually complete like one more set and get roughly the same results. Which way do you view that? Do you view that as, oh, wow, in a very, very performance decreased state, they're getting relatively equivalent growth. Fatigue doesn't seem to matter that much. Or you could say it's requiring an additional set to reach the same outcomes. Fatigue is impairing the stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
You could view it in either kind of way. So it's hard to say there. But no, I generally kind of follow your line of rationale, and I do think that's obviously has implications. But I don't know if you have any more specific thoughts.
No, I just think it's, instead of thinking about volume data or rest period data or intensity techniques or proximity to failure, to me, I just want to see really convincing evidence that you can be so fatigued going into a session such that it harms your ability to experience maximum hypertrophy from that session, which is tricky to study.
Yeah. And
we're lucky enough to be a part of projects trying to tackle that. Don't get too hyped up because it's going to take some time. But I think that's a fundamental question that will give us insight into principles, not necessarily methods or specific volumes.
So we need to be concerned about physiological limitations or really just practical ones. That's really what it comes down to.
Cool. I think we're at about our 5-minute timer for question number 1.
Yep.
I'm going to tee up the second one, and then I'll let you run with it because I think this is a little bit more in your wheelhouse.
Sure.
The second big remaining question in training science that has been on our mind recently is whether some interventions, I think probably the easiest one to think about is, the easiest realm is supplements. And creatine is obviously like the most popular supplement, maybe just behind caffeine, whatever. But it's interesting to think about whether creatine, if we roll with that example, whether it has a stepwise benefit such that it kind of raises your floor, you get a little bit stronger, you get a little bit bigger, and then you just kind of stay there. So it doesn't actually change your rate of gain after that. Or does it have this prolonged effect such that not only does it raise the floor, but it also increases the rate of growth or the rate of strength gain after, like, indefinitely? I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm super interested in this topic, honestly. This has been something I've been interested in for a long time. Going off of the last question, if fatigue is not an issue and performance can be impaired and we can elicit the same hypertrophy, I have always struggled with the idea that something like creatine would really impact hypertrophy that much. Like it just never really made sense to me based on the additional amount of reps that you get, or even just like conceptually from a mechanistic perspective. I don't really understand how that's going to improve the hypertrophy stimulus per se. Mm-hmm. What does make sense to me, and there was actually a recent paper that just came out that kind of demonstrated this, at least in concept, is that you do kind of seem to get this stepwise effect where you load creatine, or creatine fully saturates the muscle, you get an increase in muscle size. But when you make a midpoint measurement, or really early on in the intervention, you can see that the creatine group has like this relatively large increase in muscle size. But then from there, if you measure them again at post and kind of let them go through a resistance training intervention, the training effect is essentially the exact same. But if you only were to measure them at pre and post, you would assume that the creatine is actually causing a increase in the training effect, but that may
not increasing the slope. It's just artificially increasing the starting point.
Exactly. And so that may kind of change the way you view supplementation in a few different ways. I mean, creatine is the obvious example. And so that type of stuff is really interesting to me. It's like you said, it's most relevant in the kind of the supplement context, but I don't think we have that many studies for creatine in particular. And this all just kind of comes back to the idea that, really, really well-formulated questions require time and careful planning and really understanding what you're asking. And I think understanding kind of what creatine does, I think it would be important to have those really early measurements that allow for this effect to occur, to see if it mediates that training effect over the long term. Because if not,
that'd be a really fun one to design.
100%. Yeah. And that would be a really, really good project if anybody's looking for one. And I think that's important because from a muscle size perspective, I think people kind of take that creatine all the time, assuming that it's modifying the training effect, when in reality, maybe this is where the loading phase comes back. You load your creatine right before you get on stage. You get the acute benefits of an increase in muscle size, but you didn't have to take it for however long. Obviously, creatine monohydrate is super cheap, but it's interesting kind of conceptually to think about the fact that maybe this supplement in particular, or other supplements, aren't actually modifying the training effect, but they're just kind of giving you this acute bump that you can access at any time.
One of my favorite questions to ask, like seasoned academics, so people that have been in at their university position for decades, is whether type 2 fibers are more likely, like have greater growth potential compared to type 1 fibers.
And strength, right?
What's that?
And strength, right?
And potentially, specific force as well.
Yeah.
The reason I love to ask that question is because a lot of those people are very confident in their answers, but a lot of people are confident in different directions. And I just find it really interesting that that's the case. And so whenever I get the opportunity to ask that question to someone where that's in their wheelhouse, I ask it. I've also asked this question to a couple of academics as well. And for this question, again, whether creatine kind of has a stepwise or a prolonged benefit, I usually get a blank stare because they haven't really thought of it before. Sure. And you brought this up to me, and I'm like, yeah, okay, you see what I see, like this. I think we both kind of like independently thought of this. Like, you see what I see in the sense that, like, to my knowledge, no one's really thoroughly explored whether this is something we can take off the supplement counter whenever, or if it's something that big creatine is trying to make us take 5 grams per day every single day, when that's really not necessary.
Timer.
All right.
Good wrap.
Last one. In a given time period, is there a cap to muscle growth? Is there only so much that you can grow? And this is most important in advanced trainees. Reason being is I think in untrained or less trained trainees, their capacity for growth is so big, I think it's a little bit less important. So reason being, you could make the argument, if you look at our volume meta-analysis, for example, that sure, we don't see a clear plateau in terms of additional volume kind of capping muscle growth, but you could just say that, yeah, it's because those people, they're not all untrained, but even if they are trained, they're not as well trained as me. Fair. And therefore, they don't really have a cap to growth. But me, I can only grow so much. So if I go from 10 sets per muscle group per week to 20 sets per muscle group per week, that's by definition junk volume, because I'm not going to see any additional benefit. I've already capped out the stimulus I can actually benefit from at 10 sets per week. Ultimately, I don't think we have an answer to that question. And that would have implications for volume, like I just mentioned. That would also have implications for magnitude of calorie surplus. And I think people are starting to be in tune with this for this example, right? In the sense that, generally speaking, it's suggested that less trained folks can have a bigger surplus because they have greater growth potential, whereas more advanced trainees are going to have a smaller surplus because they can only grow so much. To me, I think that might also apply on the training side. potentially. And ultimately, we just don't know. So I would love, and this is one I've thought about, I would say a little bit less in terms of how to attack the research question, but I do think that's an interesting principle-based question that would have downstream implications on a lot of different things, is whether there is a cap, a limit, at which point any additional optimization, additional calories, additional better training isn't actually going to get you any additional benefit.
The reason I think it's different between calories and training is that I think the caloric intake supports the stimulus, whereas the training is the stimulus, is kind of, or the primary stimulus is the way that I view it. So yes, I think there is from a practical perspective, I think there's a cap at the rate at which you can accumulate tissue for an advanced lifter in any given period of time. And the way you max that out is by having the best training stimulus in that period of time. But because you're an advanced lifter, the rate at which you can do that is going to be at a lower, relative energy surplus to max that out, essentially. And so you're essentially supporting the maximum rate of gain for an advanced individual with a lower calorie surplus because you can't grow as fast.
So you think like the workload to outcome relationship is probably similar. It's just the outcomes are so much smaller. Okay. And I think that is more likely, because I would venture to make the claim that even in advanced trainees, you're going to benefit from optimizing your training.
Exactly. And I think we were talking a little bit about this the other day. I think you can do that from two perspectives. One, I'm not growing a ton, so the relative differences between those additional, steps of volume or whatever you want to talk about the training stimulus, those aren't as large, so maybe it doesn't matter as much. But you could also make the argument that I'm an advanced lifter. I need to grow as fast as possible because I want to notice it in a reasonable period of time. So every single thing that I can do is really, really important. So I think you can really view it from kind of both perspectives. Yeah. But in general, I think you're going to grow at an overall slower rate as an advanced lifter. That has implications for the amount of energy you need to support that maximum rate of growth. And that also has implications on the training stimulus that you want to try to apply to make sure that if we set the same standard for the amount of weeks that we're evaluating our progress for an advanced lifter, you got to make sure that rate is as high as you possibly can to make sure you can notice anything at that same time window.
I'm trying to simultaneously listen to you and think of how you would even go about studying this, and I got nothing.
Yeah, that's hard.
I would say this third one was the least baked in my head.
The design that I thought would be interesting, and I honestly don't spend too much time in the nutrition research. I don't know if this exists, but it's basically just a volume study intertwined with a nutrition surplus study. I think that would be interesting.
Across varying training statuses. That'd be sweet.
Yeah, that'd be sweet. But yeah, to start, high volume, low volume.
Someone wants to give incentives so we can get
versus surplus.
N of 300.
Yeah.
Be our guest, and we can tell you how to set it up. That would be what would that have to be? 12, at least 8 groups. Think of like the Helms surplus study, and then
8. Oh, if you want 3 groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, do they have 3?
Yeah, maintenance, small, large surplus. I think you could get away with maintenance, large surplus.
Maintenance, but then you don't get like the dose response.
Correct.
Let's go 3. So you would need 3
groups,
3 conditions
per both volume. I guess you could do within subjects.
No,
it's.
No, you can't.
Well,
hey, one side of your body is gonna have a larger surplus than the other.
Well, no, you could do within subjects.
Volume
component.
Okay.
So the between subjects component is the nutrition component. Within subjects is the volume part of it. Okay, so
that's the map is out.
3 groups basically, trained, untrained. There you go. Not too bad. So 6.
But you would also kind of want like a dose response of training.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, put that on the wish list. Yeah, this is basically how it goes when designing research. You're like, no, I want to see like the dose response. Not only from 0 to X, you want 0 to 0.5X to X, but then it's like, okay, now you're just going to answer nothing. And then people complain about the way the study was designed and say it should have been designed another way.
You could do a mixed,
if you just thought of that.
Mixed volume comparison where, everybody's randomized to 2 volumes out of the 3. And you still do within subjects. You still get within subjects comparisons. I think that's probably the way I do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe a little more feasible.
Yeah, a little more feasible,
but still tricky.
The trained on
part of it.
I've
heard Helms talk about the Yeah, I mean, just I do not envy anyone that tries to manipulate someone's calorie surplus size.
Oh.
That sounds pretty rough. So
Yeah.
that'd be tricky. But nonetheless, man, in hindsight, we had a couple honorable mentions noted that we don't have time for, but they might be a little more interesting than that third one we just went over. So maybe we'll have to extend that to the future. But hey, thank you for tuning in. This was enjoyable for me, so I don't really care if you enjoyed it or not. But no, I take that back. I appreciate you for listening, especially if you got to this point. Hey, let us know what you thought of the show. Let us know what questions you have. If there's anything you want us to expand upon, let us know. Honestly, our biggest struggle is moving on to the next thing. So if you want us to go into something deeper, we can, or you can tell us to move on quicker. Maybe that would be good feedback as well. But nonetheless, make sure you subscribe on your podcast player of choice. Leave a rating and review there. Subscribe on YouTube. Leave us a like. Leave us a comment. Helps us out a lot. Go to datadrivenstrength.com. See the stuff we offer. And we appreciate the support. We'll see you in the next one.